Item: SCP-514. Object Class: Euclid. Special Containment Procedures. There is currently no permanent containment site for SCP-514. See Addendum 2. SCP-514 is currently being tracked by Mobile Task Force Lambda-4 aka Birdwatchers, who are under orders to observe SCP-514. In the event that SCP-514 strays near a densely populated area or an area where its presence will be easily noticed, Mobile Task Force Lambda-4 is authorized to use the One in order to manipulate SCP-514's migration patterns. Access to SCP-514 and the is restricted to Mobile Task Force Lambda-4. Level 4 personnel may also have access, but must have O5 level approval beforehand. Any experiments and weapons tests with SCP-514 must be performed exclusively at the Foundation Advanced Weapons Research Facility. In the event that SCP-514 risks public exposure or capture by rival groups, Mobile Task Force Lambda-4 is authorized to terminate the threat by any means necessary. It is highly recommended that such threats be terminated before they reach SCP-514's zone of influence, though this is not strictly necessary. Description: SCP-514 is a flock of Columba livia domestica, or homing pigeons. Visual analysis confirms that these pigeons are in fact the kind used in white dove release ceremonies. However, the type of ceremony they were used in, or the identity of who bred these doves is currently unknown. What makes SCP-514 unusual is the weapon and aggression nullification zone of influence it seems to project around itself. This zone of influence projects itself in a roughly 500 meter radius around the flock, though this estimation varies depending on the flock's size. This zone of influence renders every known type of weapon inoperable and often destroys affected weapons after prolonged exposure. For instance, firearms will immediately jam or misfire, explosives will be rendered inert, and melee weapons will decay into dust. Also, the items SCP-514's zone of influence destroys appears to be selective. For further details, see Experiment Log 514-A. In addition to its weapon nullification ability, SCP-514 can also somehow suppress violent emotions and intent in sentient beings within the zone of influence. Interviews with staff and civilians who had been exposed to the zone of influence said that they felt very calm and content, even when they felt stressed and angry just moments before. For further details, see Experiment Log 514-B. Currently, there appears to be no harmful or lasting effects to being exposed to SCP-514's zone of influence. Rigorous physical and psychological screening of individuals exposed to the zone of influence showed nothing out of the ordinary. SCP-514 was first discovered when numerous reports of weapons stockpiles were reported as having been destroyed in numerous African nations. While the initial reports were written off as poor maintenance on the part of the owners of the weapons, additional reports of sightings of a flock of homing pigeons, which are uncommon in Africa, garnered Foundation interest. An investigation team was sent to track SCP-514 where they encountered a team claiming to be affiliated with the Manor Charitable Foundation, who were also tracking it. The MCF members admitted they released SCP-514 in an effort to end all conflict in Africa, despite not having a reliable way to control its movements. Unfortunately, the MCF was apparently unaware that SCP-514's aggression suppression effects were only temporary once affected subjects were no longer within its zone of influence, and they would resume hostilities with improvised or primitive weaponry once SCP-514 left. In addition, SCP-514's random movements caused only certain regions to be disarmed, leaving them vulnerable to invasion by their unaffected neighbors. It took another 3 weeks before MTF Lambda-4 were able to bring the to control SCP-514's movements. The MCF members then challenged the Foundation team for possession of both SCP-514 and the. Since both parties were still under SCP-514's effects, the conflict was resolved through a single round of rock, paper, scissors, with the Foundation being the victor. The MCF members then fled the area before they could be further questioned. The origin of SCP-514 and how it came into the possession of the MCF remains unknown.